Maria Tanaka stood in the hallway of Riverside Hospital with her 3-year-old daughter Yuki sleeping against her chest, and she was close to breaking. It was Yuki's birthday, 3 years exactly, and Kenji Shimazu, the man she had loved and trusted, had not sent a message, had not called, had not appeared with flowers or a gift or even a card scrawled in that terrible handwriting of his. The hallway around her was a blur of movement. Nurses in their white uniforms rushing between rooms, visitors carrying balloons and cellophane-wrapped boxes tied with ribbons that spoke of celebration, of family obligation, of the ordinary rituals of remembering. But there was no one here for Yuki, except Maria. There had been no one for 3 years. She had known, of course, that Kenji was dangerous. She had known that his family, his Yakuza family, was something she could never truly understand. A dark constellation of loyalty and violence and ancient codes that operated according to rules that had nothing to do with the law or morality as ordinary people understood it. But she had believed in those early months when he held her and promised things in the darkness of her apartment that he was different. She had believed him when he said he wanted out, that he was searching for a way to leave that life behind, that Yuki would be the reason he changed, that this child would be his redemption, the anchor that would pull him from darkness into light. Instead, Yuki existed in her life as proof of his capacity to abandon what he could not control. At least, that is what Maria had told herself repeatedly. That is what she had repeated to herself on the nights when she worked double shifts at the clinic, when she came home at 3 in the morning with her feet aching and her hands still smelling faintly of antiseptic, when she found Yuki sleeping in the small futon they shared in the tiny bedroom of their tiny apartment, and Maria would lie down beside her and feel the weight of her exhaustion like a physical thing pressing down on her chest. The financial pressure had become unbearable. She worked double shifts, sometimes triple shifts at the clinic. Her mother helped when she could, but her mother was sick now too. Her lungs, her heart, the cumulative damage of a lifetime of work and worry, and the medical bills were piling up in the apartment like snow that never melted. There were stacks of them on the small table by the window, bills printed on thin paper in black text that made no sense to Maria, bills that represented a world of expensive care, of medications, of specialist appointments that her mother's insurance would not cover. She had wanted to buy furniture for the nursery, safe, beautiful furniture from a shop downtown that she had walked past 100 times without allowing herself to look directly at it. Furniture that would have transformed Yuki's corner of their shared bedroom from a place where a poor woman raised a child alone into something that resembled aspiration, that felt like a place where a child actually belonged, where there was room not just for survival, but for something like childhood. But the money was never there. There was never enough. There was only enough for rent, for food, for the cheapest medicines, for the bare minimum of what kept them alive and functioning in the world. On Yuki's 3rd birthday, in a fluorescent hospital hallway with her daughter asleep against her chest, and her mother asking softly if she had heard from him, if there was any word from Kenji, Maria made a decision that felt simultaneously like surrender and like strength. She would stop waiting. She would stop believing in the story of Kenji Shimazu, the man who loved her, the man who wanted to change, the man who had promised her a different life. She would accept, truly accept, that Yuki only had one parent now, and that parent was her. Her strength, her sacrifice, her love, that was all that mattered. That had to be enough. She was tightening her grip around this resolve, buttressing herself against the ache of it, when the hospital doors opened and a man stepped through them, and the entire corridor seemed to contract and hold its breath. He was not alone. 3 men entered with him, their suits pressed to a perfection that spoke of money and power and the kind of attention to detail that came from a lifetime of intimidation through appearance alone. Their movements were synchronized in a way that made even the doctors pause their conversations, turning to watch. But it was the man in the center who made Maria's chest tighten and seize. Kenji Shimazu was taller than she remembered, or perhaps she had simply been smaller when they were together, smaller and softer and more willing to be held. His face had hardened into something almost unrecognizable, a kind of careful blankness that made him look carved from stone, a sculpture of a man rather than a living person with capacity for warmth. There was a scar she did not recognize running along his left temple, thin and precise, the kind of scar that came from sharp edges and sudden violence. His hair was longer, pushed back from his face with clear intention, and she could see the edges of tattoos at his wrist, the traditional marks of his organization, rendered now with no attempt at concealment. Something about the deliberation of that visibility, The fact that he was not hiding it anymore made her understand that his life had changed in fundamental ways she could not compute, that he had moved deeper into the world she could never reach rather than out of it. He saw her immediately. His eyes found her in the crowd, cutting through the visual noise of the hallway with the precision of a weapon, and for a moment, just a moment, that hardness cracked. She watched it happen with absolute clarity, as if time had slowed. She watched something human emerge from behind his face, something raw and surprised and achingly vulnerable, and then she watched it disappear again, replaced by a kind of careful, controlled emptiness that was somehow worse than his original coldness. It was the look of a man who had learned to suppress his own heart, who had made the decision long ago that feeling too much was a luxury he could not afford. He did not approach her. She had a moment to process this, a moment in which she thought perhaps he had not seen her at all, that she had imagined the moment of recognition. But then he walked directly to the information desk, spoke quietly to the receptionist in words Maria could not hear, and then turned to walk back toward the exit. He did not look at her again. It took her a moment to understand what she was witnessing. He was here. He had come to the hospital on Yuki's 3rd birthday, and he was leaving without acknowledging her, without explaining himself, without doing anything except confirming, through his presence and his silence, that he was choosing to stay away. He was choosing distance. He was choosing to remain separate, to remain unconnected, to remain what he had been for 3 years, absent. She should have felt vindicated. She should have felt the sharp satisfaction of being right, of having predicted his abandonment, of having made the correct choice in building her life without him. Instead, she felt something breaking inside her, something fundamental fracturing like glass, and she held Yuki tighter, so tight that she was afraid she might wake her, and she tried not to cry in front of the doctors and nurses who were already looking at her with the kind of pity reserved for women whose lives had not turned out the way they imagined, for women who had been promised love and received solitude instead. That night, after Yuki was asleep in their small shared bed, Maria sat in her tiny kitchen at the small table with a cup of cold tea that she had forgotten to drink, and she made the decision that would change everything. She would hire a lawyer. She would pursue child support. She would make Kenji acknowledge what he had made and then abandoned, and she would use the law to force him to see what he had done to her, to Yuki, to their lives. It was not a generous impulse. It was not born from a desire to include him or rehabilitate him or give him another chance. It was born from anger so profound it felt like a physical thing living in her chest, a creature made of hot metal that moved with every breath she took. It was anger at the waste of it, at the unfairness, at the simple fact that she was exhausted and alone, and he was alive somewhere, probably comfortable, probably forgetting, probably never thinking of the child he had left behind. The lawyer she found was a woman named Sachiko, sharp-eyed and meticulous, who specialized in family law and who had a particular interest in holding irresponsible fathers accountable. Her office was small but expensive, and Sachiko herself moved through it with the confidence of someone who had won many battles and understood that the laws governing family were simply another arena in which power operated and justice could be claimed. Sachiko asked for details, dates, evidence, witnesses. Maria provided what she had. She provided the photos from those early months, Polaroids of her and Kenji together, his arm around her, both of them smiling in ways that felt now like they belonged to different people. She provided the text messages that had stopped appearing, the gradual silence rendered in notification after notification, the message bubbles that appeared and disappeared as he started to say something and then changed his mind. She provided the hospital records that showed Kenji's name on the birth certificate, his signature authorizing her care, his acknowledgement in writing that this child was his. She provided her own testimony of abandonment, speaking the words aloud to another woman, which somehow made it more real and more painful at the same time. What she was not prepared for was what Sachiko discovered when she began to investigate. 3 days after their first meeting, Sachiko called her back to the office, and her voice was different. It was careful, something like shock underneath the professionalism, and it was this carefulness that made Maria's stomach begin to turn in warning. "Ms. Tanaka," Sachiko said, "I have been trying to understand the financial situation of Mr. Shimazu. I wanted to establish the level of support he could be required to pay, what his legal obligation might reasonably be. But I have discovered something that I need to discuss with you before we proceed further. I need to ask you some questions about your employment, about your housing, about how you have been managing your expenses over the past 3 years." They sat in Sachiko's office with the afternoon light coming through the windows, casting everything in shades of amber. Sachiko turned her computer screen toward Maria. On it was a bank account statement, carefully formatted, showing deposits and transfers and a kind of financial intentionality that made Maria's hands begin to shake. The account belonged to a shell corporation, but the name of the account holder, listed in a secondary position with careful legal discretion, was Kenji Shimazu. And in that account for the past 3 years there had been regular, substantial deposits. Every month, without fail, every single month, money had been moved into a separate fund, a fund that was substantial enough to represent more than casual support. This was serious money. This was the money of someone making a commitment. Sachiko scrolled down, and Maria's throat closed as she began to understand the pattern. The deposits traced a path through various accounts, through shell corporations, and carefully constructed layers of legal protection, but they all trace back to Kenji, and they all seem to serve a single purpose. Sachiko pulled up a spreadsheet she had created, matching the dates and amounts of his deposits to major expenses in Maria's life. The deposits began 9 months before your daughter was born, Sachiko said quietly. That's before you even told him you were pregnant, according to your statement. Maria could not speak. She could barely process the implication. He has been paying for medical care, Sachiko continued, moving methodically through the spreadsheet. All of your medical care during pregnancy, including the private clinic appointments you mentioned, the ultrasounds, the blood work, for the hospital where your daughter was born. He made a substantial donation to the obstetric wing of Riverside Hospital approximately 6 weeks before your labor. For the clinic where you work as a nurse, it appears he made a major donation to them 3 months after you were hired. I suspect that is how you were able to receive such generous employment terms, why they were able to accommodate your need for flexible hours, why they provided better insurance than most clinics in the city. For your mother's medical expenses, he appears to have been funding her treatment entirely through an intermediary. For your apartment rent, Miss Tanaka, for utilities, for food bills, for the pharmacy, for everything. Sachiko paused, letting the weight of this settle. For the past 3 years you have not been raising a child alone financially. Mr. Shimazu has been paying for almost everything. You simply did not know it. The room felt like it was rotating. Maria's hands felt numb, as if someone had drained all sensation from her fingertips. She tried to speak and could not. She tried to understand and could not. She had believed with absolute certainty that she was managing on her own, that her long shifts and her sacrifices and her careful budgeting were sustaining them. She had believed this lie so completely that she had built her entire sense of self around it. Maria, the strong one. Maria who did not need help. Maria who was raising her daughter alone. There is more, Sachiko said, and her voice was even more careful now, even gentler. There is a property, a house, in your name, with a deed filed 6 months ago. Do you have any knowledge of a property purchase? Maria did not. She had not bought a house. She could not afford a house. She could not afford... He bought it for you, Sachiko said. Or more precisely, he purchased it through a series of intermediaries, and the deed was placed in your name. The property is fully paid. It is entirely yours. No mortgage, no debt, nothing standing between you and complete ownership. And Ms. Tanaka, according to the survey records and the interior descriptions I could access, there is a nursery, a room designed specifically for a child. Maria stood up. She could not remain sitting, could not remain in a chair as if this were a normal conversation, as if her entire understanding of her life could simply be revised, rewritten, revealed as a construction, a fiction, a beautiful and terrible lie. She walked to the window of Sachiko's office, and she looked out at the city below, at the vast spread of buildings and streets and human lives unfolding without her, and she tried to understand how everything she had believed about herself could be simultaneously real and completely false. Where is it? Maria whispered. Where is the house? Sachiko provided the address, and Maria's hands shook as she copied it into her phone. She did not recognize the street name. She did not know this neighborhood. The house had been purchased in a part of the city she had no connection to, and yet it belonged to her. It contained a room designed for her daughter. It had been waiting. She did not go directly there. Instead, she went to pick up Yuki from school, and she held her daughter's hand and she walked through their neighborhood. This neighborhood that she had chosen because it was safe, because it was close to the clinic, because she had believed she would be alone in raising this child, and therefore she had chosen carefully, methodically, trying to create an environment that would mitigate the damage of her loneliness. She walked past the playground, where she had taught Yuki to use the swings, pushing her daughter up and catching her as she came back down, Yuki laughing with the pure joy of a child who does not yet understand that the world contains loss. She walked past the small library where she took Yuki for story time every Saturday morning, where they sat together on the floor with other children and their mothers, and Maria had tried not to wonder what it would feel like to be part of something, to be claimed as someone's family rather than always operating at the margins of community and connection. And then, without quite deciding to do it, without consciously choosing to change direction, she walked in a direction she had not walked before, following the address on her phone like a woman in a trance. Yuki asked questions, asked why they were here, where they were going, asked if it was a surprise, asked if there would be a park. Maria answered automatically, saying nothing, saying everything, saying nothing that made sense. The house appeared without fanfare. It was set back from the street, hidden behind a small wall in a garden that someone had clearly maintained with meticulous care. The plants were thriving. The gate was unlocked. It swung open under her hand, moving smoothly on hinges that had been oiled and cared for, and she walked through it, Yuki asking questions, asking why the gate opened so easily, asking if this was someone's house, asking if they should knock before they went in. The front door was also unlocked. Maria's key would work, she realized, if she had known to use it, but the door had simply been left open, or perhaps had been unlocked for her, an invitation rendered in the simplest possible way. Inside, it was the most beautiful place Maria had ever been. Sunlight came through tall windows on every side of the structure, illuminating every room with a golden glow that made everything look slightly dreamlike. The walls were painted in soft colors, blues and greens and warm creams that were not quite white, not quite beige, but something in between, something that felt calm and deliberate. There was furniture, proper furniture, real wooden pieces that had been selected with care and understanding. The kind of furniture that made a space feel like a home rather than a collection of objects. There was a kitchen with modern appliances, stainless steel, and clean lines. A kitchen designed for someone who cared about cooking, about nourishing people, about the dailiness of care rendered in meals. There was a living room with tatami mats in one corner, a gesture toward tradition and comfort. There were shelves full of books, entire walls devoted to them, and many of them, she realized immediately, were children's books. Books she had mentioned wanting to buy Yuki in passing conversations. Books she had looked at in stores and put back because they cost money that was needed elsewhere, money that was never available, or so she had believed. But it was the nursery that destroyed her. It was on the second floor, down a hallway lined with more books, more careful choices made for a child, more evidence of someone thinking about what would be good for a growing mind. The door was painted a soft blue, not a bright or aggressive blue, but a blue like evening sky, like calm water, like peace. On the door was a painted image of a moon and stars, rendered in silver and white, so delicate that at first Maria thought they might be real light, actual moonlight captured and preserved in paint. Maria opened it and she stepped into a room that was, without question, the most carefully designed space she had ever seen. The furniture was beautiful and safe, rounded corners, soft materials, everything designed so that a child could move through it without danger. The bedding was soft, high quality, obviously chosen to be comfortable and gentle. The walls were covered in murals, gentle scenes of forests and animals and dreams, a landscape that seemed to have been painted by someone who understood what it meant to want to give a child not just a safe place to sleep, but a place that would inspire wonder, that would suggest to a young mind that the world contained beauty. There were toys, carefully selected, age-appropriate, expensive, the kind of toys that educators recommend, that develop fine motor skills and imagination rather than dependency on screens. There were shelves of picture books and soft animals, each one seeming to have been chosen individually, with thought about whether this particular book was the right one for a 3-year-old girl. There was a window that looked out onto a small garden, and through that window, Maria could see flowers blooming in careful patterns, a garden designed to be beautiful when viewed from inside a child's room, and on the nightstand beside the small bed, there was a key. It was not an ornate key, not something with decorative embellishment or precious metals. It was simple, practical, made of brass that had been worn from handling, and the wear marks on it suggested that this key had been held many times, that someone had touched it repeatedly, had carried it, had thought about it. There was a tag attached to it, made of simple paper, and on the tag, in handwriting that Maria recognized immediately, that she had thought she would never see again, was written a single word: Yuki. Maria picked up the key and she could not breathe. The brass was warm as if it had been held recently. She understood in that moment what the key represented. It was not the key to this house. The house was hers, completely hers, and any keys she needed would come with the deed. This key was something else entirely. This key was what he had left when he could not stay. This key was what he had given instead of his presence, instead of his name spoken aloud in introduction, instead of the easy love that a man without his complications could have offered, could have given freely without danger, without cost. This key was a father's acknowledgement. This key was proof that he knew about her, that he thought about her, that somewhere in the midst of his dangerous life and his terrible responsibilities and his commitment to a world of violence and hierarchy, he had found time to think about his daughter. This key was the sum total of his choice to protect this child by building a place for her, a safe place, a beautiful place, a place where every single choice had been made with the knowledge that it would be where she slept, where she dreamed, where she would grow into the person she would become. She sat on the small bed and she wept. The tears came from somewhere deep, somewhere that she had sealed off and protected and refused to acknowledge. The tears came from the part of her that had hoped, that had believed, that had waited. The tears came from the part of her that had been angry for so long that she had almost forgotten what lay underneath the anger, which was grief, which was love, which was the ache of a woman who had believed herself abandoned by someone she could not stop loving. Yuki, confused and frightened by her mother's tears, by this new emotion, by something she could not understand, climbed into her lap, and Maria held her daughter, and she finally began to understand the truth that Kenji Shimazu had been showing her in silence for 3 years. He had not forgotten. He had not abandoned them. He had simply loved them in the only way he believed was safe, in the only way he thought would not hurt them, in the only way he could imagine protecting them from the complexity and danger of his own existence. She left the key on the nightstand. She could not carry it yet. The weight of it was too much. Instead, she carried Yuki back downstairs, and they walked through rooms that had been prepared for them with a kind of desperate, silent love. Every detail spoke of someone thinking about this child, about what she would need, about what would make her feel safe and loved. Every color, every toy, every book, every piece of furniture. It was all a conversation that Kenji had been having with the ghost of his daughter, trying to love her in the only way his dangerous life would allow. Maria went back to Sachiko's office the next morning, and she asked to withdraw the child support claim. Sachiko was surprised, her sharp eyes questioning. "He has been providing for our child all along," Maria said quietly. "Better than any court order could have guaranteed. Better than I even knew. I need to understand why he chose to do this. I need to understand what it means, and I need to do that before I decide what happens next." It took 3 weeks. In those 3 weeks, Maria moved into the house with Yuki. She allowed herself to sleep in the beds that had been prepared for them. She read the books that had been selected for her daughter. She walked through the rooms and tried to imagine Kenji here alone, making these decisions, building this space for a child he was not allowed to claim, a child whose existence had to remain secret, whose father's name could never be spoken without danger. She imagined him walking through the nursery, looking at what he had created, touching the small bed, holding the key before leaving it on the nightstand. She imagined him in this space, this beautiful space he had built, surrounded by evidence of his love for people he could not be part of. She began to see the house differently, began to understand that every room was a letter, every detail a sentence, every choice a declaration of love made in the only language he could use. The weight of understanding settled over her like a blanket, warm and heavy. When he finally came to her, it was at night, and he knocked on the door like a visitor, like someone seeking permission to enter. It was exactly the kind of restraint that made her want to scream, that made her want to pull him inside and demand that he stop being so careful, so distant, so determined to protect her from the simple fact of his presence. But she understood then, when she saw him standing at the threshold of the house he had bought for her, that this was his way of loving her. This distance was his sacrifice. This restraint was his commitment to keeping her safe. She opened the door and he was there. And he was different in his own home than he had been in the hospital. Here, the hardness softened slightly. Here, there was room for something like hope on his face, something like vulnerability, something like the man she had loved before the world had demanded that he become something else. "The house," he said. His voice was careful, almost formal. "You found it." "I found it," she confirmed. "It was not... I did not intend for you to know," he said carefully, standing in the doorway as if crossing the threshold might damage something precious, might corrupt the sanctuary he had built. "I intended for you to have security, safety, a place where you would never have to worry about money, about survival, about the basic things that keep a person and a child alive. The house was meant to be a home for Yuki, and for you. But not, he stopped, not with me in it. I am not suitable for a home, for a child, for you. You've been here, Maria said. It was not a question. She had seen things during her time in the house, small signs that someone had been caring for it, maintaining the garden, ensuring everything was perfect, fresh flowers in the vases, the hinges of every door oiled and smooth, the nursery cleaned and cared for, the books dusted, the window looking out onto the garden kept spotless. You've been here often. I come when she is asleep, he said, and the admission seemed to cost him something, seemed to require him to acknowledge the depth of his own longing. I maintain the space. I ensure that it is safe, that nothing has broken, that nothing has fallen into disrepair. I replace the books as she grows, as she ages, as she becomes ready for new stories. He stopped again, and when he continued, his voice was quieter, more raw. I hold the nursery key. I keep it with me. I know where my daughter sleeps. I know that she is safe. This is the closest I have allowed myself to come to being a father. It is not much, but it is something I can do without hurting her. It is the only way I can love her without destroying her. Maria understood then what she had been slow to see. Kenji Shimazu had not abandoned his child. He had simply loved her, in the only way he knew was safe, in the only way he had convinced himself would protect her. He had loved her in silence, in shadow, in the careful construction of security and shelter. He had loved her through books and furniture and the meticulous maintenance of a beautiful space. He had loved her by staying away, by choosing distance, by sacrificing his own needs and desires on the altar of her safety. And that kind of love was no less real than presence. It might have been more real. Why? Maria asked. Why do this? Why spend so much? Why care when you could simply disappear? Why carry the key like some kind of sacred thing? Kenji looked at her for a long moment, and she saw in his face the answer before he spoke it. She saw the man she had loved, beneath the hardness, beneath the careful blankness, beneath the armor he had constructed to survive in his world. Because you cared, he said simply. Because you loved her enough to raise her alone even when I was absent, even when you thought I had abandoned you. Because you did not ask me for help, and so the only way I could be part of her life was to help without asking permission. Because, and here his voice became almost inaudible, almost a whisper, because the day she was born, the nurse let me hold her for one moment in the hospital hallway, just one moment, just long enough for me to understand that she existed, that she was real, that she had your eyes and your strength, and she was more important to me than my own breath. And in that moment, I understood that I would love her for the rest of my life, and I understood that the most loving thing I could do was to ensure that my life never touched hers in a way that could destroy her. The next choice was Maria's. She could accept his explanation and send him away. She could take his money and his house and his carefully maintained distance and build a life for Yuki that never included him. A life in which she was simply a woman who had been briefly touched by a man from another world, a man she had tried to love, but who had chosen darkness over light. She could protect her daughter from the complications of Kenji Shimazu, from the danger of his name, from the risk of knowing a father whose existence was complicated and dangerous. Or she could believe that the man standing in front of her, a man so committed to protection that he had sacrificed presence, had sacrificed claim, had sacrificed the simple right to be called father, to say her name aloud, to stand in daylight with his child and admit that she belonged to him, had earned the right to try something different, had earned the right to attempt something less safe but more honest, had earned the right to risk the danger of being known. She knew which choice she wanted to make. She took a breath and she asked him the question that would reshape all of their lives. Do you want to come inside? He hesitated at the threshold, as if crossing it might damage something precious, as if by entering he might corrupt the sanctuary he had built, might compromise the safety he had worked so hard to create. But then he stepped through the door, and Maria closed it behind him, and she took his hand, and she led him to the nursery, and she showed him the key on the nightstand, the key that bore his daughter's name, the key that represented everything he had given and everything he had tried not to take. I think, she said quietly, standing beside him in the soft blue room, surrounded by the gentle murals and the beautiful furniture and all the evidence of his love, that she should know who holds her key. I think she should know that she matters. I think she should know that her father never forgot her, that he was always here in the only way he knew how to be. Kenji looked at the small piece of brass in his palm, worn from his own hands, warm from being held so many times. and she watched him understand that something fundamental had shifted, that his exile, his careful distance, his silent protection had been seen, had been understood, and had been deemed not enough, that the time for darkness was ending, that the time for shadows was over. He would need to do harder things now. He would need to be present, not in the darkness of unacknowledged love, but in the daylight of a father learning his daughter's face, hearing her laugh, teaching her things, making mistakes, being imperfect and real and available. He would need to risk the danger that came with attachment, the vulnerability that came with claiming someone, the way that love could be used as a weapon against him by people who wanted to hurt him. He would need to accept that protection and presence could coexist if he was brave enough to try, if he was willing to believe that some things mattered more than security, more than distance, more than the careful architecture of his carefully constructed isolation. And standing in the nursery with the key in his hand, and Maria beside him, Kenji Shimazu made the choice to be brave. The next morning, Yuki woke to find a man sitting in the kitchen with her mother. Maria had prepared for 1,000 difficult questions, had rehearsed explanations and stories and ways of introducing the concept of a father to a child who had never had one. Instead, her daughter looked at Kenji with the simple clarity of a 3-year-old, untouched by complications or fear, and she said, "You fixed my room. It is very beautiful. Thank you." And Kenji Shimazu, the feared man, the Yakuza boss, the criminal and the outcast, the man who had built a sanctuary in silence, began to cry. This is a fictional narrative. All images and videos were generated by artificial intelligence for entertainment purposes.